Hello, Professor Lightby here. I'm going to talk over the next three um, narrations about stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, looking at it, of course, from a social psychological point of view in terms of the research and theory and knowledge that we have about these topics. Um, I will going to divide this lecture into three segments, which will correspond to three um, uh, narrations. And we're going to begin by talking about stereotypes, and then we'll talk about some of the consequences of stereotypes, namely prejudice, and a little bit about stereotype threat. And then in the third segment, we'll talk about approaches to uh, reducing prejudice. So, the most serious and most studied form of prejudice in the United States is, of course, racism. Okay, in particular, prejudice toward African Americans. Okay, now research indicates that overt racial prejudice, discrimination, have really been decreasing in the U.S. and in many other countries for the last three-quarters of a century. Okay, and keep an eye on the word overt. Okay, but there has been progress made for many decades, and when we start talking about more about specifically about prejudice, we'll see some examples of that. Okay, but elements of it are, of course, on the rise. Particularly covert forms of prejudice, but also some more overt instances of racial prejudice. Legitimate reasons to celebrate the progress we've made. Okay, but we got to acknowledge that racism remains a very sad fact of life. Okay, now the racial judgment movement was strengthened immensely following the 2020 murder of George Floyd. It laid bare the sad and terrible history of the treatment of African Americans in the U.S. and energized a movement toward greater understanding, sensitivity, and change. The anti-racism movement really sort of took off and gained a lot of traction and sort of a grip on the conscience of Americans after 2020. But of course, there was the backlash, and racial tensions seem higher than ever. As it always is, discussion of prejudice and racism is a timely topic. So let's define our terms. Okay, so you've heard these terms before. Here are the technical definitions. So a stereotype is a belief that associates a whole group of people with certain traits or characteristics. As we've seen, it's an overgeneralization of imagined or perceived feelings and knowledge of the traits of a group that's applied to kind of indiscriminately to the whole group. Okay, prejudice is basically the negative feelings toward others because of their membership in certain groups. Okay, and then discrimination is behavior basically driven by prejudice and stereotypes associated with treating people differently because of their membership in a particular group. So, if thinking now about our hopefully now familiar idea of the ABCs of various kinds of social psychological topics and involving attitudes and perceptions. So we have the A being the affect, okay, and the affect is the prejudice, the emotion, the feeling, the negative feelings in particular. Although some prejudices can in fact be positive, but we're going to focus here on negative ones. Okay, so that's the affect, and then there's the behavior. That would be the discrimination. Okay, and then the C of the ABCs of prejudice is the stereotypes, okay, the cognitions, the beliefs, okay, that go along with having a stereotype or a stance toward a group or individuals in a group. So we need to talk about how stereotypes form, okay? So we talk about social categorization. Okay? So stereotypes involve classifying people into groups on the basis of common attributes. Okay, you have a stereotype about you know, professors. Okay, so you would then that stereotype includes certain kinds of attributes and um, about professors. Okay, and so you have the stereotype, and then we basically apply it to individuals. Okay, so sometimes stereotypes have a shortcut. Okay, so we'll talk about racial stereotypes that people have toward African Americans, okay, stereotypes that they might have toward any particular kind of group. In some ways, forming stereotypes is a very natural and adaptive thing. Okay? It's a very human thing to do, okay, because it's basically a form of forming categorizations, okay. We categorize, okay, that helps us, okay, when we categorize. We don't have to like rethink the wheel every time we see a wheel, okay. We know what a wheel is and we can identify it, just to turn a phrase a little further, okay. So stereotypes help us form impressions quickly and use past experiences to guide our new interactions, okay. If we've made these categorizations, we can then rely on the categorization, okay, in terms of making a quick and dirty, if you will, impression, okay, of an individual who basically fits that category, okay. But the serious drawback is when we categorize, we tend to overestimate the differences between groups, and we tend to underestimate the differences within groups. So when we apply our stereotype, okay, let's say we have a stereotype toward a particular racial or ethnic group, okay, and the person we're encountering a person who belongs to that group, okay, we're going to probably label that person and categorize them and assume certain traits on the basis of our stereotype, thinking basically that they're more alike than they are different. So when we apply our stereotype, we're kind of underestimating the unique individual characteristics of an individual who belongs to the group. Okay. And we also, if we have a stereotype, these people are this way, okay, we're going to be overestimating the differences between groups, between them, us, okay, between that group and another group, okay. So that's this kind of serious drawback of pigeonholing individuals because we're completely ignoring, when we apply a stereotype, the existence and the fact of individual differences between people. So here we can talk about in-groups versus out-groups, okay? So stereotype content, okay, that is the stereotypes we hold both from our in-groups, the groups we belong to, and in particular out-groups, groups that are not us, okay? That content is provided by socialization, okay, within a culture, okay. We'll see more about that later, okay. And the application of the content is supercharged by the strong human tendency to divide people into in-groups and into out-groups, okay. So, we're much more likely to apply a stereotype and to have stereotypes of out-group members. Okay, remember, we're underestimating the differences within groups, okay, than we are of in-groups, okay. So the consequences, we exaggerate perceptions of differences between in-groups and other out-groups, and this, of course, also contributes to the formation of and reinforcement of stereotypes, okay. and hence what happens is we end up with a phenomenon known as outgroup homogeneity. So outgroups tend to be seen, again, we underestimate the differences, we underestimate, we see that the outgroup members as more homogeneous, more similar to each other. Part of that has to do with lack of familiarity and lack of diversity of experiences with outgroup members, but also as soon as we categorize an unfamiliar person as a member of our in-group or an out-group, we immediately process information about them differently. So members of in-groups are processed when we perceive, and we're basically forming an impression, if you will, by homing in on individual features. Okay, but when it comes to an out-group member, the first thing we notice is, oh, that's an African American. Okay, if, for example, we're a white European American with stereotypes about African Americans, and they work both directions. So the first thing we do with an outgroup is we categorize the person by group. Okay, oh, that's an African American. Okay, and then processing perceived continues in terms of the presumed features of the group to which that outgroup member belongs. Okay, making the processing sort of superficial. We're not honing in on on individual qualities of the person. We're allowing, and it's a natural thing to do that we have to practice not to do, our categorization, our schemas, our stereotypes about the person to kind of influence our attributions, to influence our perceptions and where we go with them. Okay, now we can see this very readily in personality judgments. Even see it in face recognition. Okay, most of you have probably heard about they all look alike effect. Okay, this is also known as the own group bias effect, also known as cross-racial bias. So the whole idea here, okay, is that, and this is really well documented, whites can more readily and easily identify, for example, out of a police lineup, okay, other whites than they can blacks, okay, and it flips. Blacks can more easily identify members of their own group, okay. There's other blacks, for example, from a photo array or from a police lineup, if you will, okay. Then they are able to identify whites, okay, and in fact, for whites, blacks do kind of look more alike than they really are, okay, and for blacks, whites do, okay, and this holds true across a whole lot of different out-group, in-group distinctions. So whites have a more difficult time identifying Hispanics than they do other whites, non-Hispanic whites. Blacks have a more difficult time identifying Hispanics, identifying Asians, okay, than they do other blacks, okay. So Hispanics have a more difficult time with out-group members. So it works really across all kinds of different racial, ethnic pairings, okay? And the reason that it happens, okay, really has to do with this whole idea of categorizing, okay, automatically out-group members in terms of the group, which kind of limits your focus on an individual feature, whereas members of your own group, you tend to home immediately on individual features, okay? So part of a little bit has to do with having learned the features of our own group better than others, but most of it than of other groups. Most of it has to do really with this ready categorization of outgroup members. Okay, so let's look at some of the social, cultural, and motivational factors associated with stereotypes. Okay. So why are some categorizations more likely to dominate our perceptions than are others? Okay. Well, sociocultural factors influence what type of categorizations dominate our perceptions of others. Okay, so and motivational factors, what we want to see or what we're motivated to see, they also affect how we categorize others. Okay, um, highly negative stereotypes can cause perceivers to process outgroup faces even more superficially, okay, more like objects and animals than like fellow humans, okay. This is the phenomenon of dehumanization, okay, that if you have a really high degree of prejudice and highly negative stereotype toward members of another group, I'm not saying that anybody here would, but let's say if someone does, okay, their processing of the face may be extremely superficial, okay. It won't even and not even really involve a lot of the face processing, for example, and attribute processing parts of the brain when we're looking at other people. Okay, it's like the person that we're processing, that's being processed by this super prejudiced person, is really not even human. Okay, the processing is more like how we process objects and animals. Okay, so that can be a consequence of highly negative stereotypes and categorization. Okay, so one of the ways in which let's talk about how stereotypes form. Let's look a little bit at illusory correlations. Okay, this is an interesting phenomenon where you might perceive a relationship between a group of others, of other people, okay, an outgroup, if you will, or just another group, okay, and certain kinds of qualities, okay, even if none exists, okay. So there's some famous research, laboratory research done that has kind of laid this out in terms of how it might work and how it might then be expanded to understand in part how illusory correlations form in the real world. So imagine a study in which the participants in the study are basically given this task of, getting familiar with a village of individuals. Okay, so they're basically given these vignettes, these brief descriptions of, let's say, 120 different people, okay, who live in this village. Okay, and the vast majority of them are Group X people. Okay. That's the majority, but a subset, in this case, 1/5 or 1/6 of the group, okay, is of the villages is made up of Group Y people. Okay, so that's the minority group. So you basically try to get familiar with this village of people, learning about them. And when you read about the Group X and Group Y people, okay, the case of the Group X people, well, a behavior is described for each of them. And in 75 of the 100 cases, okay, the Group X people perform basically a positive thing. They engage in a positive behavior. A minority of them, 25%, 25 of them, okay, engage in negative behaviors. Okay. Now with the Group Y people, you've got 15 who engaged in positive behaviors and 5 who engaged in negative behaviors. Okay. And notice that the percentages are the same. 3/4 of the Group X people are, quote, good people. They did positive things. Okay. 75% of the Group Y people did positive things. Okay, it's the same. Okay, so after they basically spent time familiarizing themselves with the people in the village, okay, the participants who've engaged in this kind of lengthy task, okay, are asked questions, okay, including, so. what percentage of the people do you think, of the group X people, do you think um, engaged in positive behaviors? What percent of the group Y people engaged in the positive behaviors? Okay, and what you find, and then their impressions. How much do you like group X people? How much would you think you'd like these group Y types? Okay, and what you can see is that the results, and these are not. This is illustration, but they're consistent with what the actual data from these studies show. You can see that the perception after the fact is that, well, it's pretty accurate with the group X people, okay? But if you look at the group Y people, the percentage of negative behaviors is overestimated, okay? They more readily remember, okay, the negative behaviors engaged in by the group Y people, and they sort of form this correlation. Oh, there's a correlation. Group Y people are more likely, 50%, to engage in negative behavior than are the group X people, 25%. So we've got a loser. There's no real correlation, but the memory is such that they've formed this illusory negative correlation between how positive the behavior was and whether the person was group X or group Y. Okay. Now that's sort of so there's this recall of more undesirable group Y people, but they also like them less, as I mentioned a moment ago. Okay, so what's this all about? Well, going back to our when we talked about social cognition. Well, actually, maybe going forward. No, when we talked about attribution, we talked a little bit about this. But remember the concept of salience and distinctiveness. Okay, so basically, we know that the minority group, the people that are fewer in number, are going to be more salient because they're going to stand out more. Okay, and we also should know that negative behaviors, okay, are more distinctive. Okay, capture more attention. Okay, so when we put these two kinds of things together, the negative behaviors by the group Y people, okay, stand out, and they tend to dominate the perception and the impressions that we form of them. Okay, so there's this illusory correlation that's formed, even though there is no relationship between positivity and group. Okay. All right. So, well, there's other research that suggests, consistent with this, that when actual instances, the co-occurrence of actual instances, if we remember availability, when things that stand out, okay, are going to, actually dominate our perceptions. Okay. All right. So that's one way in which stereotypes can form. Okay. Now, how stereotypes form? Stereotype content. And then this important idea of automaticity. So everyone learns the stereotypes of stigmatized outgroups. It's inevitable during socialization and the learning that occurs within a culture. Okay, everyone, black, white, liberal, conservative, unprejudiced, prejudiced, more prejudiced, less prejudiced, all know the stereotype, okay, that exists of, for example, African Americans, the stereotype that exists of Latinos, Latino Hispanic type people, okay, stereotypes that we have. So those are particularly stigmatized outgroups, but we also have stereotypes about less stigmatized outgroups that we can't avoid learning. Italians, okay, Italian Americans, okay, we have stereotypes about those. We learn them automatically. New Yorkers, okay, there's a stereotype across the country of what New Yorkers are like. But we'll bring it back to stereotypes that involve, for example, racial prejudice. It's inevitable not to learn through socialization the stereotypes of African American that exist about African Americans. Okay, there's media effects. Okay, there's the reality that's created by systemic racism. Okay, so if part of your stereotype is that African Americans, are less educated, well, that's a reality. Okay, because of systemic racism on average. Okay, so it might get into the into our stereotype, and we can't avoid it. Okay, we have selective exposure. Okay, if we grow up in a situation where our exposure to African Americans, if we're white, is limited to when we have to drive through poorer parts of town, when we are exposed to mainly where we work, that most of the African Americans tend to be more represented in the less prestigious jobs, the less and so on and so forth. Okay, so all of this around us compel on top of what we're taught. Okay, by people. Okay, creates this whole idea that we're going to learn the stereotype. Okay, and the affect that becomes associated with the stereotype becomes an automatic, conditioned, and usually unconscious response. Okay, so this is where we get into this implicit racism or implicit prejudice in general. Prejudice that operates unconsciously or unintentionally because we've learned these stereotypes. In some cases, been conditioned to have a negative kind of response, emotional and affective response associated with the stereotype, and indeed, so we become, so we have this kind of implicit prejudice, implicit kinds of ideas that operates unconsciously and unintentionally. Okay, because of this conditioning. Okay, it's all about having been conditioned and learned kind of negative stereotypes. And stereotypes are automatic. Okay, so stereotypes can be activated implicitly and automatically without awareness. Okay, be activated by mere exposure to members of the stereotype group or by stereotype-related primes, influence subsequent thoughts, feelings, behavior, even in perceivers who are relatively low in prejudice and do not endorse the stereotype. Okay, so at some implicit level, okay, stereotypes can weave into our thoughts, feelings, and behavior and be activated that way, even when we're not, we're low, shall we say, in prejudice. So here's an excellent study that shows, basically reveals the existence in mind of the racial stereotype. Okay, and its telling impact on unrelated judgments. Okay, so here's a summary of the method that was done by that's employed by Graham and Lowry, 2004. Okay, so basically they had police officers and in the second experiment, juvenile probation officers. Let's read through it. Were subliminally exposed to words related to the category black or to words neutral with respect to race. Okay. In a presumably unrelated task, officers read 2 vignettes about a hypothetical adolescent who allegedly committed either a property crime, shoplifting from a convenience store, or an interpersonal crime, assaulting a peer. The race of the offender was left unstated, okay, and the scenarios were ambiguous about the causes of the crime. So basically, people are primed with essentially the black stereotype or not, okay, and then later they're going to be asked to give judgments about this juvenile offender, okay, for whom they later rated the hypothetical offender a number of traits and made judgments about culpability, expected recidivism, and punishment. Okay, so here are the subliminally presented priming words, presented 5 times each for 150 milliseconds. Okay, so basically, the priming task is people sit in front of a computer and they're told, well, you're going to get these words. You're not going to be able to really recognize them, but you're just going to see flashes of light. And they don't tell them they're words. You're going to, so basically, you're going to focus in the middle of the screen. There's a little dot there, and you're going to see flashes. Okay, and your job is going to be to tell us whether you saw the flash on the left of the screen or the right. Okay, now what those flashes really are very briefly presented, okay, subliminally presented words. Okay, now in the race prime condition, so the words, there's basically two lists, okay, so you can see some of the words: graffiti, Harlem, homeboy, minority, mulatto, segregation, basketball, black, gospel, hood, Jamaica, roots, okay. And the second list, similar, Afro, Islam, dreadlocks, and so on. You get the idea. Remember, this is 20 years ago, so some of these words that would prime the black stereotype might not be as relevant as they were then. Okay, and in the race neutral list, there you see the words are all kind of neutral kind of things. They have nothing to do with race or anything. So what happened? Okay, so if we look at the results, okay, so we have a race priming or a neutral condition. Okay, and the juvenile, okay, is being the juvenile offender, okay, that they're reading this case study of, okay. Remember, they're being asked later to rate the juvenile offender, okay. And you can see, look at the effects then. So we have a 7-point scale. We look at the effects of rating. Now, that we don't know the race of the juvenile offender, okay. So they don't know it, okay. So you can see in the neutral condition, the in the race condition, the offender is rated as actually more mature. Okay, it's part of the stereotype that African Americans mature earlier than do whites. Okay, seen as more violent. Okay, bad, no difference there. Global assessment, they rate the there's still not much of a difference there, okay. But the global assessment in terms of kind of a negative kind of thing and various traits, slightly more in the race prime condition. In the race condition, the offender is rated as more culpable for the crime. Greater expectation that the person will recidivate, okay, and end up back committing another crime. And they also recommend a higher level of punishment, okay. So all of these differences here, okay, are all because, okay, in this case, the race stereotype, the black stereotype was activated, okay, was primed, okay. And it's a negative kind of, when you're priming kind of a negative stereotype, okay, one that includes the idea that the blacks are sort of more hostile, okay, more prone to crime, if you will, and so on. And even though it was primed unconsciously, and even though the target, okay, in this case, the juvenile offender, wasn't even necessarily black, okay, what was activated by the race priming basically caused the person to be rated more negatively, okay, and to seen as more culpable, given more punishment, and so on, okay. So, powerful effect of an unconscious priming of a seemingly irrelevant thing, okay, basically the racial stereotype, the black stereotype. So basically, that's evidence that stereotypes can be automatically activated, okay, and actually influence our perception of the world around us once they are activated, okay. So factors that make activation more or less likely: prevalence in the culture, how prejudiced the perceiver is, okay, how motivated the person is to protect their self-esteem, okay. We'll get into that a little bit more later when we start talking about social identity theory. And it's also an interesting factor is our intrinsic motivation to avoid applying stereotypes. Okay, we're less vulnerable to it if we're highly motivated not to go there. Okay, uh, and so that and so for example, when we're present when we encounter if I'm a white guy and I encounter an African American, if I'm highly motivated so basically just the mere presence of an African American may activate the stereotype. Okay, but if I'm motivated not to let that happen, I can work on it. I can keep it under wraps and not let myself apply the stereotype. Okay, if I'm less motivated, okay, if I'm taken unawares even, okay, then the encounter with the African American may in fact compel me to, I might in fact apply my stereotype. Okay, so motivation to avoid prejudice, to avoid going there with regard to stereotypes is very important in terms of kind of cutting off automatic activation. But sometimes it's not possible. Okay, especially when the prime, okay, is not something that we're consciously aware of. Okay, so when we encounter an African American and I'm a white guy, okay, I can be, I'm highly motivated to avoid it, okay, because it's right there, okay, and I can avoid it because the prime, okay, the veritable person, okay, is I'm conscious of, and I can put the brakes on any kind of activation of a stereotype as well as I can. So this ties into the shooter bias, right? Okay, so 23 years ago, a very famous tragedy. Okay, the police shot Amadou Diallo 41 times. Okay, he was hit 19 times and killed. And basically, what happened was the police basically came across this person who they had suspected of having sort of committed a crime, and they sort of chased him down. Okay, and he ended up being cornered. He got to a door, entree to his apartment. Okay, he turned around. He kept complaining, I didn't do anything. It's whoever he wanted isn't me, etc. Okay, so he basically went for inside his jacket to pull out his wallet. Okay, to show who he was. Okay, it was mistakenly identified as a gun. He did not have a weapon. Okay, so. Um, So this became known as the shooter bias, okay, and it generated a considerable amount of research, okay, because the idea, and this was basically what was tested, was that there is this negative stereotype, okay, it associates African Americans with guns, okay, and that in this really quick situation, really rapidly moving situation. This association between blacks and guns, okay, automatic activation in a split second. It's activated and boom, Amadou Diallo is shot and killed. Okay, now. So this generated a lot of research interest in social psychology. Okay, and basically, this is some of the findings where stereotypes can alter perceptions about the presence of weapons and the decision to shoot. That yeah, okay, you know, if we have a stereotype, we're more likely to perceive a weapon, okay, uh, when the person is black than when the person is white, okay. Um, that it's not really related to racial bias, okay. Has more to do with the automatic activation of this stereotype, the stereotypical conditioned association that people have be, between African American men, okay, and guns, okay. So we can look at uh, some studies here. So here's a good example of just one kind of study that's done where people are, basically, and this has been done with college students and obviously police officers and so on. So you present all these scenes, okay, um, in which there's either this is one way of doing it, there's either a white male or a black male in the scene, okay, and the white male, I'm sorry, in white or black, they're either carrying brandishing an innocent object, a banana, a checkbook, something like that, or a gun, okay? And so what people are instructed to do is that if it's a gun, okay, you need to press this button, okay, and zap the person, okay, if you will, okay. But don't do it if it's not a gun, okay. Only if you see a gun should you shoot, if you will, okay. And what you find is that people more readily that there really isn't any difference between whites and blacks in terms of the percentage of time they correctly get it, okay, when the person's holding a gun, okay. However, when it's not a gun, okay, blacks are more participants are more likely to shoot, okay, the black guy than they are the white guy, okay. So you have this, shooter bias in the sense that they more readily see the gun even when it's not there, okay. Uh, when it's a black person, a black guy, than when it is a white guy, okay. And other studies have been done, okay, that basically, you just basically flash faces, okay, of blacks or whites in advance of presenting a picture of you know, of, of an object, okay, and they ask people to make the decision to shoot or not, whether or not that's a gun or not, okay, or a weapon, okay, and of course when you've been primed with the pictures of blacks, you're more likely to see the gun when it's not there, okay, or at least be faster to shoot if it's a black than a white guy and there is a gun. So that's a pretty well established effect, and it's not related really to how prejudiced the person is. Okay, so it's really related to this automatic activation of a stereotype that we all tend to have. So the solution is, well, police have come up with, or agencies have come up with kind of ways to kind of limit this, but it still occurs. Okay, and but the shoot first, ask questions later is problematic given the fact that we're going to see it as a gun and feel more endangered automatically if it happens to be a black guy than a white guy. Okay. All right. So, how stereotypes distort perceptions and resist change. Well, so we've seen some of the ways in which stereotypes form in this conditioning of basically a stereotype and the affect associated becoming a kind of a conditioned kind of implicit thing. Okay, the more general ways in which stereotypes distort perceptions is, well, we've seen it before: confirmation bias and self-fulfilling prophecies. Okay, so if we have certain expectations about a person based on our stereotypes, okay, then we're going to more readily interpret, seek, and create information that seems to confirm. Little brief interruption there. Sorry about that. Okay, so that's the confirmation bias. False expectations created by a stereotype can cause us to act in such a way that the stereotype group member really does behave in a stereotype consistent way that confirms the expectations. Okay. So, for example, if if for example, and we've seen this when we talked about self-fulfilling prophecies in previous narrations, that if so for example, you have a stereotype about African Americans. You're a white person, if you will, and it basically influences you to you think that they might be, for example, maybe your stereotype is that they're sensitive to racial kinds of things that smack to them. This is just your stereotype of sensitivity to racial kinds of statements and so on and so forth. So you basically engage in a really kind of stiff kind of, you're nervous kind of way. Okay, you might communicate that to the person, the African American person you're talking to, which compels a reaction of not perceiving you as very friendly, seeing you as kind of stiff, and might actually cause the person to behave in ways, if the person might be cold and seem to be kind of more preoccupied with stereotype kinds of related worries and so on, and so that might affect your impression, maybe even confirm your stereotype. Okay, so the expectations that we have by the stereotype may cause us to behave in ways that a person really does behave in a stereotype consistent way that confirms their expectations. Attributions and subtyping. So of course, we're always looking for explanations about the causes of other people's behavior, right? I mean, that's attribution theory. Well, what may happen, okay, is that based on your stereotype, okay, the kind of, you see behavior is kind of ambiguous, okay, it's not really sure what the behavior is all about. But if you have a stereotype, you're going to interpret that behavior in ways that are consistent with your stereotype. You're going to make an attribution, okay, based on the stereotype, okay. Subtyping, very problematic thing, okay, because with subtyping we're creating a special category, okay. When we see a person who clearly does not fit the stereotype, rather than kind of learning and that weakening our stereotype of the group, okay, what we might do is we might basically create another category, okay, a subtype, okay, that accounts for the acceptance of the rule so that the stereotype doesn't get touched, okay. So, think of some of the common ones that, he's an exception. The suburban blacks are not the same as blacks in general, and so on. That kind of thing. You get this this creating a subcategory, so the person may behave in ways that completely contradict the stereotype. Okay. But your stereotype doesn't get weakened, okay, unless you're overwhelmed with those types of people, okay, quote unquote, because you can that this one individual or a few individuals, they're the exception to the rule, okay, they're that kind of fill in the blank, okay. So subtyping is a way for stereotypes, the kernel of the stereotype to be preserved, okay, the nut, okay, um, by placing an individual who's an exception outside of the stereotype as a different category. Problematic if we're trying to reduce stereotyping. All right, so I'm done with this for today, okay? So next time I'm going to talk about in the next narration the idea that how stereotypes contribute to lots of bad things, okay? Stereotype threat, and then of course prejudice. So we'll get to that in the next narration.